Hello, my name is Matthew Genslinger, and I'm the pastor of the new Church of Concord, and this is my weekly reading of the text of the sermon that I gave last Sunday here at the church. Now, as I always do, I will be also providing you with a reading of the lessons, but for those of you who would like to skip ahead to the sermon itself, I'll provide you with a little link here to help you do that. Now, in relation to the sermon for today, it's important to understand that when the children of Israel first entered into the promised land, Jehovah gave them a very strict command that they were supposed to utterly destroy all of their enemies. And when they first entered into the promised land, the children of Israel did this. They began by utterly destroying all of the inhabitants of a city called Jericho and a city called Ai. However, in the story that we're going to be reading for today, there are some people from a city called Gibeon, the Gibeonites, who figured out a way of tricking the children of Israel into making peace with them. So with that, we will begin with our first reading, which is taken from the book of Joshua, chapter 9. And they who dwelt in Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai. And they worked with cunning and sent an embassy. And they took worn-out sacks upon their donkeys, and wine bottles worn out and ripped and mended, and shoes worn out and spotted on their feet, and worn-out clothing on them. And all the bread of their provisions was dried up and moldy. And they went to Joshua to the camp of Gilgal, and said to him and to the men of Israel, From a land far off have we come, and now make a covenant with us. And the men of Israel said unto the Hivite, How shall we make a covenant with you? Perhaps you dwell among us. Who are you, and where do you come from? And they said unto him, From a land very far off your servants have come, because of the name of Jehovah your God. For we have heard his fame and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites. And our elders and all they who dwell in our land said to us, Take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go to meet them, and say unto them, We are your servants. And now make a covenant with us. This our bread we took hot for our provision from our houses on the day we went out to go to you. And now, behold, it is dried up and moldy. And these wine bottles which we filled were new, and behold, they are ripped. And these our clothing and our shoes have worn out from the very long journey. And so the men took from their provisions, but they did not ask counsel of Jehovah. And Joshua made peace with them, and he made a covenant with them to let them live. Now at this point, the children of Israel eventually figured out that the Gibeonites were actually inhabitants of the land. And so we continue. And so all the chiefs said unto all of the congregation, We have promised unto them by Jehovah, the God of Israel, and now we cannot touch them. Let them live. And let them be hewers of wood and drawers of water unto all the congregation. And so that day Joshua made them hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation, and for the altar of Jehovah unto this day. Amen. And our second 2 readings are both from the book The Arcana Celestia, speaking about the correspondence of these Gibeonites being hewers of wood. And our first reading is from Arcana 41:45. Every person who is being regenerated is first in immediate good, in order that it may serve for introducing genuine goods and truths. Thus, the person who is being regenerated is perfected by degrees. For example, he who is being regenerated believes at first that the good which he thinks and does is from himself, and that he also merits something. For he does not yet know, and if he knows, he does not comprehend, that good can flow in from some other source, nor that it can be otherwise than that he should be recompensed, because he does it from himself. Unless at first he believed this, he would never do any good. But by this means, he is instituted not only into the affection of doing what is good, but also into knowledges concerning good, and also concerning merit. When in this matter he has been led into the affection of doing what is good, he then begins to think differently and to believe differently, namely that good flows in from the Lord, and that by the good which he does from his own, he merits nothing. And at last, when he is in the affection of willing and doing what is good, he altogether rejects self-merit, and even has an aversion for it, and is affected with good from what is good. And finally, one last passage from the Arcana Celestia, number 1110. People who have assumed that righteousness and merit lay in their good works, and so have attributed the power of achieving salvation to themselves, not to the Lord and to his righteousness and merit, and who in thought and life have confirmed themselves in this idea, have their assumptions converted in the next life into delusions in which they seem to themselves to be cutting wood. When they are doing their work of cutting wood and are asked whether they are not tired out, they reply that they have not yet done enough work to be able to merit heaven. While they are cutting pieces of wood, it seems as though something of the Lord is underneath the wood, so that the wood appears as merit. And the more something of the Lord seems to be in the pieces of wood, the longer they remain in that condition. But when this delusion starts to fade, they are getting nearer the end of vast stations. At length, they become such that they too are able to be admitted into good communities, though they still waver for a long time between truth and falsity. Because they have led a conscientious life, the Lord takes great care of them and is sending angels to them time and again. These are the people who in the Jewish church were represented by hewers of wood. Amen. So this week's sermon is called Living with the Gibeonites. As the children of Israel prepared to enter the promised land, Jehovah gave them a strict command. They were to utterly destroy all of their enemies. When they first entered the land, this command was followed, as they brought down the walls of Jericho and later slew all the inhabitants of a city called Ai. On a spiritual level, this utter destruction of their enemies represents times when we must utterly destroy the evils and the false ideas that we find within our own hearts and minds. There are certain hellish loves, like the love of adultery, that we need to drive away if we ever want to inherit the promised land. In our story for today, as news of Joshua's victories began to spread through the land, many kings joined forces to fight against Israel. But the Gibeonites had other plans. They deceived Joshua, convinced him to make a covenant with them, and so were able to stay in the land of Canaan, where they lived among the children of Israel for many years. So who were these Gibeonites? Well, Gibeon was a small city in the heart of the Promised Land. It was located a few miles northwest of Jerusalem, and at this time, we're actually taught that the people of Gibeon were some of the better inhabitants of the land. They were Hivites, descendants of some of the ancient peoples that used to inhabit the land of Canaan. And as such, these Gibeonites had retained some of the goodness and some of the true teachings that the ancient churches once possessed. Like their moldy bread and their worn-out water skins, the quality of this ancient goodness and truth had fallen quite drastically, but some remnants or bits and pieces of it still remained with them. Now, once we understand who these Gibeonites were, we can better understand what they represent. The people of Gibeon represent things that may not be ideal, but they nevertheless have some goodness within them. The Gibeonites represent loves and ideas that may on some level be false and even evil, but they are of such a nature that the Lord can still use them for something good. This is why, in his providence, the Lord permitted these people to stay in the land of Canaan. Now, to better understand this representation, we can look at how the Gibeonites actually served Israel. After Joshua discovered their deceit, he could not destroy them because of the covenant he had made. So instead, he made them hewers of wood and carriers of water. Wood is often used in the scriptures to represent goodness, or what is good. Think about the cedar wood from Lebanon that was used to build Solomon's temple, or the wood that Moses was told to throw into the bitter waters of Mariah to make them sweet. Wood represents the things of love and charity. Wood is a wonderful material that you can make beautiful things out of. But here, because the Gibeonites were involved, hewers of wood represent people whose goodness is tainted with a sense of merit. They think that the good things they are doing come from themselves, not recognizing that all goodness comes from the Lord alone. And so when they do good things, they have the impression that they should be rewarded or reimbursed for their good deeds in some way. People who possess a sense of merit in the good things that they do, or hewers of wood, are often not focused on truly serving the Lord and their neighbor. They're more focused on their own reputation and on their own ability to someday make it to heaven. Now, this kind of merit-seeking life is obviously not something we should strive after. But again, the point of this story is to show us that in some instances, the Lord can actually use these less than ideal states of life for something that is truly good. I'd like to read again a portion of the passage we read earlier from the Arcana Celestia, which explains this very well. And remember, this passage is talking about people who believe that all goodness comes from themselves and that they merit something for the good things that they do. And we read, unless at first he believed this, he would never do anything good. But by this means, he is initiated not only into the affection of doing what is good, but also into knowledges concerning goodness, and also concerning merit. When in this manner he has been led into the affection of doing what is good, he then begins to think differently and to believe differently, namely that good flows in from the Lord, and that by the good which he does from his own, he actually merits nothing. A powerful and very important passage. We see this ability of the Lord to use our less than ideal states, not only in the fact that the Gibeonites were permitted to stay within the land, but in the fact that as hewers of wood, they actually served Israel by providing wood for the sacrifices and the burnt offerings in the tabernacle. Isn't that interesting? The wood used in the most important part of the children of Israel's worship came from the wood collected by these Gibeonites. Now, we won't spend as much time here with the water, but these Gibeonites were also carriers of water. While wood represents goodness or things relating to love and charity, water represents truth. Think of the water that the Lord brought out of a rock to quench the children of Israel's thirst in the wilderness, or the living waters that the Lord promised the Samaritan woman at the well. Now, as with the wood, the fact that it was the Gibeonites carrying this water means that this water represents truth that has been tainted in some way. One passage hints that the Gibeonites being carriers of water represents people who love learning truth or gathering in knowledge, but they aren't using that knowledge for anything useful. Again, not a great state to be in, and one that can hinder our spiritual development. But can we also see how the Lord might be able to use this imperfect state in a person, this mere thirst for knowledge, to eventually lead us to something better? Why the Gibeonites were permitted to stay in the land. Now, why is this story and this reality so important for us to reflect on? For starters, it helps us change the way we view other people's imperfections. As we fully engage with life in this world, we are going to come into contact with a lot of imperfect human beings. And in this regard, we've probably all heard the phrase that we should look for the good in other people. We should look for the goodness in other people. Angels are always looking for the good in other people, and so is the Lord himself. However, when we think about looking for the good in other people, I think we often approach this in very black and white terms. Here's this person I've met, or this colleague I have to deal with at work, who seems to have a lot of unattractive qualities. But even though they have all these bad qualities, I'm going to do my best to ignore that part of them. I'm going to call upon my higher self and cast out of my mind all of the bad and evil parts of this person, and instead only focus on the good or the good parts that I can see in them. This sounds reasonable, and sometimes this might be a very useful and heavenly thing to do. But here, in this story of the Gibeonites, notice that the Lord seems to be suggesting something a little bit different. Instead of simply ignoring or outright rejecting what we perceive to be another person's imperfections, the Lord is actually inviting us to see that even their imperfections might have something good within them. In fact, these imperfections that we are so good at seeing in other people might even be important to the Lord. Think about that. The Lord may be preserving these imperfect states because He knows they can act as a stepping stone to something better. One example of this that I think we can all appreciate is how we handle imperfect states in our own children. I can certainly speak for myself when I say that every day my kids are acting from less than ideal motives. They're constantly doing things because they do have an unideal desire to look good, to impress their friends, and to get some kind of reward. In many ways, our own children are hewers of wood and carriers of water. But of course, with children, we don't condemn them for this or even see their unideal states as necessarily being bad. Why? Well, because we know and can see that these imperfect states are very important first steps that the Lord is using to gradually form them into the people that He created them to be. Now, this is easy for us to see and appreciate in children, right? But again, can we have this same kind of perspective when it comes to all God's children? Our adult friends, our colleagues, the people we share traffic jams with, our politicians who are running for the highest office in our land, even our own spouses at times. Instead of seeing a person's imperfections and immediately wanting to tear them down, can we stop and consider that actually the Lord might be using these imperfections for something good? Now, as a closing thought for today, I would like to invite you to take all of these lessons about the Gibeonites we've talked about so far, go home and reflect on the fact that these Gibeonites also exist within our own hearts and minds. As imperfect human beings, we are always going to be doing things with less than ideal motives. We often do good things just to look good, or because we do hope to merit some kind of reward. A deep love for the Lord and our neighbor is not always why we go to church on a Sunday morning or wake up and go to work every day. We often enjoy learning and talking about things for no particularly good reason. At times, perhaps quite often, we are all hewers of wood and carriers of water. In some ways, this story of the Gibeonites makes this okay. It can be so useful just to recognize that the Lord Himself knows that we are imperfect human beings. The point in this story is that he loves us anyways. He makes provisions for these imperfections, working with us wherever we may be. Perhaps at times we need to learn to be just as gentle and as accommodating of our own imperfections as the Lord himself is. Again, this does not mean that we should make excuses for ourselves or fail to make course corrections in our lives, or that we should ever stop striving to be better. But it is also important that we recognize that living in unideal states and with imperfect motives is a normal part of the journey we are all on. If we can genuinely recognize these Gibeonites in our land and yet continue to work to follow the Lord will be able to use even our imperfections to move us forward in beautiful ways. Even our imperfections can help to build a beautiful tabernacle for the worship of the Lord, as we gradually become the kind of people that the Lord created us to be. Reading again from the book of Joshua. And all the chiefs said unto all the congregation, We have promised unto them by Jehovah the God of Israel, and now we cannot touch them. Let them live. And let these Gibeonites be hewers of wood and drawers of water unto all the congregation. And so that day Joshua made them hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of Jehovah. Amen.